Some things refuse to stay buried. The words drift through Ethan Walker's mind as he crosses the quiet corridor of the old administrative building just after 6 in the morning. Outside, a pale autumn sun rises over Coronado, California, painting the sky in muted shades of gold and silver. The ocean breeze carries the faint scent of salt through an open window, mingling with the smell of old paper, floor polish, and memories that seem trapped inside the aging walls. Ethan, a 38-year-old Navy SEAL with weathered hazel eyes and a face marked more by responsibility than age, has no reason to be here. The building is scheduled for renovation. Most of the lockers lining the hallway have already been emptied. The place feels forgotten. Quiet. Like a chapter someone closed years ago. Beside him walks Ranger, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat and intelligent amber eyes. The dog moves with calm confidence, paws clicking softly against the polished floor. Ranger has accompanied Ethan through countless training exercises and search operations. He notices things other people miss. That morning, however, something changes. Halfway down the corridor, Ranger abruptly stops. His ears lift. His body stiffens. Ethan takes 2 more steps before realizing the dog is no longer beside him. He turns. Ranger is staring at a locker near the far end of the hall. Not barking. Not growling. Just staring. The locker looks no different from the dozens around it. Faded gray paint. Minor scratches. A small vent near the top. Yet something about it has captured the dog's complete attention. "What is it, buddy?" Ethan asks quietly. Ranger does not move. He slowly approaches the locker, lowers his head, and inhales near the narrow seam of the door. Then he lets out a soft whine. Ethan feels an unexpected chill. Ranger rarely reacts this way. The dog circles once, then returns to the same spot. His nose remains fixed on the metal surface. As though he recognizes something. As though he remembers. Ethan steps closer. Dust coats the locker handle. A thin layer of grime suggests it has not been touched in years. Attached near eye level is an old plastic nameplate. Most of the letters have faded, but one name remains barely visible beneath the scratches and time. Emily Carter. Ethan narrows his eyes. The name means nothing to him. He has served on this base for nearly a decade and has never heard it before. Ranger whines again, quieter this time. The hallway suddenly feels different. Not threatening. Just heavy. Like a room where someone stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. Ethan studies the locker more carefully. Sunlight slips through a nearby window, catching something near the lower edge of the door. A faint metallic glimmer. Barely visible. Almost hidden inside the narrow gap between the frame and the locker itself. Ethan crouches. Ranger immediately steps closer, watching. The tiny flash appears again. A fragment of metal wedged deep within the seam. Too deliberate to be random. Too concealed to be accidental. Ethan reaches toward it, then pauses. Somewhere down the corridor, an old ventilation fan hums softly. The building remains otherwise silent. Ranger's eyes never leave the locker. And for reasons Ethan cannot explain, he suddenly has the feeling that this forgotten piece of metal is connected to a story someone worked very hard to erase. The piece of metal refuses to leave Ethan Walker's mind. For several seconds he remains crouched beside the locker, studying the narrow gap where the faint glimmer catches the morning light. Ranger sits beside him now, unusually still. The German shepherd's amber eyes stay fixed on the same spot, as if waiting for Ethan to understand something the dog already knows. Slowly, Ethan slips a pocket multi-tool from his belt and carefully slides the thin edge into the seam. The metal object shifts with a soft scrape. Dust falls onto the floor. A moment later, something no larger than a silver dollar slides free and lands gently in his palm. Ethan stares at it. It is not a coin. Not a military pin. Not anything he recognizes immediately. Years of wear have darkened its surface, but beneath the tarnish he can make out an engraved eagle surrounded by a circular border. There are no names. No dates. No official markings. Just a symbol. Strange. Deliberately hidden. Ranger leans closer and sniffs the emblem before looking back at Ethan. The dog releases a quiet breath through his nose. Almost satisfied. Ethan turns the object over. On the reverse side are 3 engraved numbers. Nothing more. No explanation. No clue as to why someone would hide it inside a forgotten locker. He slips the emblem into his pocket and stands. The corridor remains silent. Rows of abandoned lockers stretch into the distance beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Somewhere outside, a flag snaps softly in the ocean wind. For reasons he cannot explain, Ethan feels less like he discovered an object and more like he interrupted a story that had been sleeping for years. An hour later he finds himself inside the base archives building. The room smells of old cardboard, printer ink, and coffee that has sat too long on a warmer. Shelves packed with personnel records fill the space from floor to ceiling. Behind a desk near the back sits Harold Benson, a retired administrative clerk who now works part-time organizing historical documents. Harold is 72 years old and seems to know every file ever stored on the base. Ethan places a photograph of the locker nameplate on the desk. "Do you know anyone named Emily Carter?" he asks. Harold adjusts his reading glasses. His eyes settle on the photograph. For a second nothing happens. Then something changes. Not fear. Not surprise. Recognition. Deep and immediate. The older man slowly leans back in his chair. "Emily Carter," he repeats quietly. The name hangs in the room. Ethan notices the way Harold's expression shifts, as though an old memory has unexpectedly opened the door. "You knew her?" Harold does not answer immediately. Instead, he stares toward the archive shelves. Toward the past. "That is a name I have not heard in a very long time," he finally says. Ethan waits. Ranger lies calmly beside the desk, ears alert. "What happened to her?" Ethan asks. Harold opens his mouth to respond. Then his gaze drops. His eyes lock onto the emblem resting beside Ethan's notebook. The color drains from his face. Silence fills the room. The old man stops breathing for a moment. His fingers tighten around the edge of the desk. "Where did you get that?" he asks. The warmth has vanished from his voice. Ethan feels his pulse quicken. Inside her locker. Harold's eyes remain fixed on the emblem. A full 5 seconds pass before he speaks again. When he does, his voice is barely above a whisper. "That should not exist." Ranger lifts his head. The room suddenly feels smaller. Outside the window, the morning sunlight continues to brighten the base. But inside the archives, something hidden for more than a decade has just begun to wake up. Harold Benson continued staring at the emblem as though it had appeared from a dream he had spent years trying to forget. The old archive room suddenly felt colder. Outside the narrow windows, gulls drifted over the Pacific under a bright California sky, but inside, neither man seemed aware of the passing morning. Ethan remained silent. Years in the teams had taught him that silence often revealed more than questions. Ranger stayed beside the desk, watching Harold with calm, alert eyes. Finally, the older man stood and walked toward a row of filing cabinets at the back of the room. His movements were slower now. Careful. Almost reluctant. He stopped before a cabinet marked retired personnel records and rested his hand on the metal drawer without opening it. For several seconds he simply stared. "I always wondered if someone would come looking one day," he said quietly. Ethan folded his arms. "Looking for Emily Carter?" Harold nodded. "Or looking for answers?" The drawer slid open with a long metallic whisper. Inside were hundreds of folders arranged alphabetically. Harold moved through them methodically until he reached the letter C. Then he froze. The space where a folder should have been was empty. Ethan immediately noticed. Missing? Harold slowly closed the drawer. That folder used to be here. Used to? Harold exhaled. 3 years ago I checked these records during an inventory review. Her file was still present. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his chest. And now it is gone. Yes. Neither man spoke for a moment. The absence of the folder seemed somehow louder than if it had been found. Missing files happened. Lost paperwork happened. But not often in a facility where records were preserved for decades. Ranger suddenly rose to his feet. His ears lifted. He moved away from the desk and crossed the room toward a shelf in the far corner. Ethan watched him carefully. The German Shepherd paused near a stack of archive boxes that had not been opened in years. Dust coated the cardboard lids. Ranger lowered his nose and sniffed along the base of the shelving unit. Then he sat. Ethan knew that signal. Ranger had found something. Harold looked puzzled. What is he doing? Ethan was already moving. He knelt beside the shelf and examined the area. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then his eyes caught a narrow gap between the shelving unit and the wall. Barely visible. Reaching inside, he felt paper. Old paper. He carefully pulled out a thin manila envelope hidden behind the shelf. Dust drifted through the sunlight. The envelope had yellowed with age. No postage. No official markings. Only one handwritten name across the front. Emily Carter. Harold stared. I have never seen that before. Ethan carefully opened the flap. Inside was a single photograph. The image had faded over time, but the figures remained visible. A group of men stood together near a military transport aircraft. Most wore civilian clothing. One woman stood among them. Young. Blonde. Smiling slightly despite the wind pushing loose strands of hair across her face. Ethan instantly recognized her from the identification picture attached to the locker assignment records he had reviewed earlier that morning. Emily Carter. But that was not what made his pulse quicken. Someone had deliberately blacked out nearly every other face in the photograph using thick dark marker. Every face except hers. Every identity erased. Every story concealed. Ranger remained seated beside the shelf, watching quietly. Ethan turned the photograph over. Nothing. No date. No names. No explanation. Just one image and a mystery growing larger with every answer it revealed. Then Harold leaned closer. His eyes widened. He pointed toward a figure standing at the edge of the photograph. A face that had not been blacked out. A face both men recognized immediately. Because according to official military records, that man had been declared dead nearly 15 years ago. For several moments neither Ethan nor Harold spoke. The photograph rested between them on the archive table like a message delivered from another lifetime. Ethan knew the face immediately. Commander Nathan Brooks. According to official records, Brooks had died during an overseas operation nearly 15 years earlier. His name appeared on memorial plaques. His service history ended with a formal notice of loss. Yet there he was in the photograph, standing only a few feet from Emily Carter. Alive. Real. Unmistakable. Harold slowly lowered himself into a chair. That cannot be possible, he murmured. Ethan kept studying the image. Years of operational work had taught him to trust facts over assumptions. The photograph was old, but it was authentic. There were no signs of manipulation. No reason to doubt what his eyes were seeing. Ranger remained beside the table, his ears slightly forward, as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. Ethan turned the photograph over once more and examined every corner. A tiny stamp appeared near the lower edge. Barely visible beneath years of fading. Building 14. Storage Annex C. The words meant little at first. Then Harold looked up sharply. Storage Annex C was closed 12 years ago. Ethan met his gaze. What was kept there? Harold hesitated. Personnel transition records. Temporary files. Unprocessed reports. Ethan slipped the photograph into a protective folder. Then that is where we start. Less than 30 minutes later they stood outside a long concrete building near the edge of the base. The structure sat apart from the newer facilities. Its paint had faded beneath years of coastal weather. Sea air carried the scent of salt and sun-warmed asphalt across the empty parking area. The place looked forgotten. Ranger stepped from the vehicle and immediately became alert. His nose lifted toward the breeze. Ethan unlocked the entrance using a temporary access authorization and pushed open the heavy door. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight streaming from high windows. Inside, endless shelves stretched across the dim interior. Boxes. Cabinets. Decades of stored history. Most had likely not been touched in years. Ethan followed the numbering system referenced in an old facility map. Row after row passed in silence until they reached a section labeled Personnel Review Archives. Ranger suddenly changed direction. The German Shepherd moved ahead of Ethan and stopped beside a cabinet positioned near the back wall. His tail became still. Ethan recognized the behavior immediately. Another clue. Another hidden thread. The cabinet drawer opened with effort. Inside were folders stacked tightly together. Most carried ordinary labels. Routine records. Administrative reviews. Transfer paperwork. Then Ethan found something unusual. A folder tab with no name. No identification number. Just a blank strip where information should have been. He removed it carefully. The folder felt thinner than expected. When he opened it, his heartbeat slowed. Several pages had been deliberately removed. Jagged edges remained where documents once belonged. Entire sections were missing. Dates interrupted. References cut short. Yet one surviving page remained near the center. A routing sheet. On it appeared a familiar name. Emily Carter. Ethan stared at the page. Beneath her name was a classification code he had never seen before. Not military. Not civilian. Something else entirely. Then he noticed a handwritten notation near the bottom margin. 3 words written in fading blue ink. Do not archive. Ethan felt a chill despite the warm California afternoon beyond the walls. Someone had not simply hidden Emily Carter's history. Someone had tried to erase it. The words lingered in Ethan Walker's thoughts long after he left the storage annex. Do not archive. They did not sound like an administrative instruction. They sounded like a warning. The late afternoon sun hung low over the California coastline, casting long golden reflections across the base. A cool breeze drifted inland from the Pacific, carrying the scent of salt and sea grass through rows of buildings that had witnessed decades of service and sacrifice. Yet all Ethan could think about was Emily Carter. The deeper he looked, the less she resembled an ordinary civilian employee. Ranger trotted beside him as they returned toward the administrative district. The German Shepherd appeared calm, but Ethan had learned long ago that the dog often sensed patterns before people did. Back inside the archives building, Harold Benson carefully examined the surviving page from the anonymous folder. His brow tightened. I remember seeing this classification code once before, he said quietly. Ethan looked up. Where? Harold removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Years ago. During a records transfer. I asked a supervisor what it meant. He told me to forget I had ever seen it. Silence settled between them. The old fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Somewhere beyond the walls, a maintenance vehicle rolled past. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet nothing about the investigation felt ordinary anymore. Ethan studied the routing sheet again. Most of the information had been removed, but one detail remained intact. A date. October 14th, 12 years earlier. Beside it was a location reference. Building 22. Personnel Services Wing. Harold frowned. That building was demolished almost a decade ago. Ethan nodded slowly. Then we need to find someone who worked there. The search took hours. Most former employees had retired, relocated, or simply vanished into ordinary civilian life. Evening shadows stretched across the base before Ethan finally found a name connected to the old office. Margaret Holloway. 71 years old. Retired. Living less than 10 miles away. An hour later Ethan and Ranger arrived at a small coastal home overlooking a quiet stretch of shoreline. Wind chimes swayed gently on the porch. White curtains fluttered behind the windows. The house felt peaceful. Lived in. Safe. Margaret answered the door carrying a gardening basket filled with fresh lavender. Her silver hair glowed softly in the fading sunlight. At first she seemed pleasantly surprised by the visit. Then Ethan showed her the photograph. Everything changed. The smile disappeared. Her eyes settled on Emily's face. "I knew her," Margaret whispered. Ethan noticed genuine warmth in her voice. Not fear. Not suspicion. Affection. "Tell me about her." Margaret looked toward the ocean beyond her yard. Waves rolled steadily against the shore below the cliffs. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she smiled sadly. Emily was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday. She brought coffee to people working late. She listened when others talked. Ethan waited. Was she involved in something classified? Margaret slowly shook her head. Not at first. The answer hung in the air. Not at first. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Ranger, who had been resting quietly near the porch steps, suddenly lifted his head. His ears turned toward the house. Margaret followed the dog's gaze. Her expression changed. "Wait here," she said softly. She disappeared inside and returned carrying a small wooden box worn smooth by time. As she placed it into Ethan's hands, her voice trembled. "Emily asked me to keep this if anything ever happened." The wooden box felt surprisingly heavy for its size. Ethan carried it carefully as the last colors of sunset faded beyond the Pacific horizon. The drive back to the base passed in silence. Ranger rested in the rear seat, his amber eyes fixed on the box as though he understood its importance. By the time Ethan returned to his office, darkness had settled over Coronado. The distant sound of waves drifted through a partially open window. A desk lamp cast a warm circle of light across the room while the rest remained in shadow. Ethan placed the box on the desk and studied it for several moments. The wood had aged beautifully. Small scratches marked its surface. Signs of years spent waiting. On the underside he discovered a simple engraving. EC. No decoration. No explanation. Just initials. Slowly he opened the lid. Inside rested several items arranged with careful precision. A folded photograph. A silver key attached to a faded blue ribbon. A small notebook bound in dark leather. And beneath them all, a sealed envelope. Ethan immediately noticed the handwriting. Elegant. Steady. Personal. The envelope carried a single instruction. For whoever finally asks why. A chill traveled through him. Ranger rose from the floor and approached the desk. The German shepherd placed his head beside Ethan's arm and watched quietly. Ethan opened the notebook first. Most pages contained ordinary entries. Work schedules. Meeting notes. Personal reminders. Yet as he turned deeper into the journal, the tone began to change. References appeared to unusual assignments. Unlisted meetings. Requests that bypassed normal administrative channels. Emily had not been a soldier. She had not been an intelligence officer. Yet somehow she had become involved in matters far beyond her official position. One entry stopped Ethan completely. Sometimes the people who save a mission never appear in the report. He read the sentence twice. Then 3 times. The ink had faded slightly, but the words carried unmistakable sadness. Another entry appeared several pages later. They asked me to disappear from the story. If it helps them come home safely, I can live with that. Ethan slowly closed the notebook. The room felt impossibly quiet. He reached for the photograph. It showed Emily standing outside a small building beside several men dressed in civilian clothing. This time none of the faces had been obscured. Ethan immediately recognized one of them. Commander Nathan Brooks. Alive. Smiling. Standing shoulder to shoulder with Emily. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten date from 13 years earlier. Ethan stared at it. The image had been taken nearly 2 years after Brooks was officially declared dead. His pulse quickened. The mystery was no longer theoretical. Someone had constructed an entirely false history. Then Ethan opened the envelope. A single folded letter rested inside. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. He unfolded it carefully and began reading. The first line stopped him cold. If you are reading this, then someone finally found the emblem. Ethan looked toward Ranger. The German shepherd remained perfectly still. The second sentence struck even harder. The emblem was never mine. It belonged to the man they told the world was gone. Ethan felt his heartbeat echo in the silence. Outside, a distant foghorn sounded across the dark ocean. Then his eyes reached the final line on the page. If Nathan Brooks is still alive, tell him I kept my promise. Ethan slowly lowered the letter. For the first time since discovering the locker, he realized this story was not about a hidden object. It was about a promise that had survived more than a decade, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover the truth. Sleep never came easily that night. Long after midnight, Ethan Walker remained alone in his office overlooking the dark coastline. The letter lay open beside the faded photograph. Outside, moonlight shimmered across the Pacific like scattered silver. Ranger slept near the door, though every so often one ear would lift, as if the dog sensed the story was still unfolding. Ethan read the letter again. Then again. Every sentence carried the same quiet tone. No bitterness. No anger. No attempt to explain away the years of silence. Only loyalty. Only a promise kept. By sunrise he had made a decision. If Nathan Brooks was alive, he would find him. The search consumed the next 3 days. Official records led nowhere. Public databases returned nothing. Retirement registries were empty. It was as though the former commander had stepped out of history altogether. Yet Ethan refused to stop. Somewhere between the missing files, the hidden emblem, and Emily's final words, he knew there had to be one last thread connecting everything together. On the 4th morning, that thread appeared. Harold Benson called just after dawn. I found something, he said. Ethan arrived at the archives within 20 minutes. Harold was already waiting beside a stack of recently uncovered transfer records. His eyes looked tired but determined. Without speaking, he handed Ethan a single sheet of paper. Most of the information had faded, but one line remained legible. Recipient location, Cedar Ridge Veterans Retreat, Montana. Ethan stared at the page. The transfer had occurred 11 years earlier. Beneath the destination was a name. Nathan Brooks. Ranger stood immediately. As if he understood. 2 days later Ethan and Ranger found themselves driving through the mountains of western Montana. Pine forest stretched for miles beneath a bright autumn sky. The air smelled of cedar, cold streams, and distant wood smoke. By late afternoon they reached Cedar Ridge, a small retreat tucked among rolling hills and golden aspens. The place was peaceful. Quiet. The kind of place where people went to leave old burdens behind. An elderly caretaker greeted them on the porch. His expression changed the moment Ethan mentioned Nathan Brooks. "You are not the first person to ask about him," the man said. Ethan felt hope rise for the first time in days. "Then he is here?" The caretaker nodded slowly. "He comes and goes. Keeps mostly to himself." He pointed toward a small cabin near the edge of the property. Smoke drifted lazily from a stone chimney. Ethan walked up the narrow path with Ranger beside him. Fallen leaves crunched beneath their boots. The cabin door stood partially open. Through the window he could see an older man sitting near a bookshelf, reading. White hair. Weathered features. Calm eyes. The years had changed him, but not enough. Ethan recognized him instantly. Nathan Brooks. The man looked up as they approached. His gaze settled on Ranger first. Then Ethan. Finally, the emblem resting in Ethan's hand. Everything changed. The color left his face. He rose slowly from his chair. Neither man spoke. The wind moved gently through the aspens outside. Somewhere in the distance a wind chime sang softly. Nathan's eyes never left the emblem. After a long silence, he whispered 6 words that seemed to carry 12 years of memory. "Where did you find that?" Ethan stepped forward. "In Emily Carter's locker." The older man's shoulders sank. Not from fear. Not from shock. From grief. Deep and quiet. The kind carried for years. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they glistened with emotion. Then he spoke the words Ethan never expected to hear. She kept her promise after all. For a long moment the cabin remained silent except for the faint crackle of burning firewood. Nathan Brooks lowered himself into a chair and stared at the emblem resting in Ethan's hand. The years seemed to fall away from his face. Ranger quietly crossed the room and settled beside the older man, placing his head near Nathan's knee. The gesture was simple, but it broke something open. Nathan reached down and gently rested his hand on the German shepherd's neck. His eyes filled with memories. "She always loved dogs," he said softly. Said they could see the truth faster than people. Outside, evening sunlight filtered through the aspens, painting the cabin walls with shifting gold. Ethan sat across from him and waited. He knew this was the moment everything would finally come together. Nathan looked toward the window. "Emily was never supposed to be part of our world," he began. "She worked in administration. Organized schedules. Managed paperwork. Ordinary things. But sometimes the most important people are the ones nobody notices." His voice carried neither drama nor pride. Only respect. Deep respect. Years ago a situation developed that threatened to end several careers and place innocent people under suspicion. Nothing criminal. Nothing dangerous. Just a series of mistakes that would have destroyed lives and reputations. Ethan listened carefully. Nathan continued. "Emily discovered the truth before anyone else. She found records that proved what had happened. She could have protected herself. She could have walked away. Instead, she spent months quietly putting everything back together. Correcting reports. Finding missing documents. Helping people who never even knew they needed help." The fire popped softly. Ranger remained motionless beside him. When everything was finally resolved, there was pressure to keep certain details confidential. The public story was easier. Cleaner. A few names disappeared from the records. Mine included. It protected ongoing operations and allowed several families to move forward without carrying unnecessary burdens. Nathan smiled sadly. Emily never complained. Not once. Ethan thought about the notebook. The hidden locker. The missing files. The years of silence. So she agreed to vanish from the story. Nathan nodded. Because she believed the people mattered more than the recognition. His gaze lowered toward the emblem. That emblem belonged to me. I gave it to her before I left. Not as an award. As a thank you. She tried to return it. I told her to keep it until the truth no longer needed protection. Ethan slowly removed Emily's letter from his folder and handed it across the table. Nathan unfolded it carefully. The cabin became completely still. Minute after minute passed as he read. By the end, tears shimmered in his eyes. He smiled through them. Not with sorrow. With gratitude. That sounds exactly like her, he whispered. Then he folded the letter and held it against his chest. The fading sunlight illuminated the photograph resting on the table beside them. Emily Carter smiling among people whose lives she had quietly changed. Ethan finally understood why someone had hidden her story. Not because she had done something wrong. Not because there was shame attached to her name. The truth was far more heartbreaking. She had sacrificed the one thing many people secretly hope for. Recognition. Credit. A place in history. And she had done it willingly. Nathan looked at Ethan and spoke with quiet certainty. The promise is finished now. People deserve to know who she really was. 3 weeks later the morning sky above Coronado unfolded in soft shades of blue and gold. A gentle breeze carried the scent of the Pacific across the base as service members, retirees, families, and civilian staff gathered near a newly installed memorial display outside the administrative complex. The crowd was not large. It did not need to be. Some stories were never meant for stadiums or headlines. Some stories belonged in quieter places. Ethan Walker stood near the front with Ranger resting calmly at his side. The German Shepherd's sable coat shimmered beneath the early sunlight. Beside them stood Harold Benson, Margaret Holloway, and Nathan Brooks. The older commander looked different now. Lighter somehow. As if a weight he had carried for more than a decade had finally been set down. At the center of the memorial stood a glass case. Inside rested the emblem. Carefully preserved. No longer hidden inside a forgotten locker. No longer buried behind missing files and faded memories. Above it was a simple bronze plaque. Emily Carter. Beneath her name were a few carefully chosen words. Her quiet service protected others. Her sacrifice was remembered. Nothing more. Nothing less. The ceremony itself lasted only a short time. There were no dramatic speeches. No grand declarations. Instead, those who had known Emily shared small memories. The way she always remembered names. The way she stayed late to help people finish impossible deadlines. The way she listened when someone needed kindness more than advice. Piece by piece, a portrait emerged. Not of a hero seeking recognition. But of a woman who chose compassion when nobody was watching. Nathan stepped forward last. The crowd fell silent. For several seconds he simply looked at the plaque. His eyes reflected both grief and gratitude. History often remembers the people standing in front, he said quietly. But sometimes the people who matter most are standing behind the curtain, making sure others succeed. He paused. The breeze stirred the nearby flags. Emily never asked for credit. She never wanted praise. But she deserves to be remembered. No applause followed. None was needed. The silence itself felt like respect. After the ceremony ended, people lingered. Some spoke softly. Others simply stood reading the plaque. Ethan remained near the memorial while Ranger wandered a few feet away before settling directly beneath the glass case. The dog lowered himself onto the grass and rested his head between his paws. Several people smiled at the sight. Ethan smiled too. It felt strangely fitting. After all, none of this would have happened without Ranger stopping in that hallway weeks earlier. Without one curious German shepherd refusing to walk away from a forgotten locker. As the morning grew warmer, the crowd gradually dispersed. Vehicles departed. Conversations faded. Eventually only a handful of people remained. Nathan approached Ethan one final time. His gaze moved toward the memorial. "She would have hated all the attention," he said with a soft laugh. Ethan nodded. "Probably. But she would have loved knowing people remembered." They stood together for a while without speaking. Above them, sunlight reflected gently against the glass case. The emblem glowed with quiet dignity. Nearby, Ranger remained asleep beneath the display, peaceful and content. Ethan looked toward the ocean beyond the base. The horizon stretched endlessly beneath the bright California sky. Some stories ended with victory. Others ended with answers. This one ended with something rarer. A forgotten promise had been honored. A hidden life had been seen. And after 12 silent years, Emily Carter was no longer missing from the story.